From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I want to welcome you today on behalf of the Kluge Center to a talk by Dr. Scott Johnson. Dr. Johnson received his PhD in classics from Oxford in 2005. He subsequently turned his thesis into a book entitled The Life and Miracles of Thecla, a literary study published by Harvard University Press in 2006. And it deals with the important Greek saint's life from that 5th century AD. He subsequently edited 2 books, Greek Literature in Late Antiquity, published by Ashgate in 2006, and the Oxford Handbook of Late Antiquity, which is forthcoming from Oxford University Press. And he has recently finished translating The Miracle of Thecla for the new Dumbarton Oaks Medieval Library series, which Harvard University Press will soon be publishing. In addition to these books, he has published numerous articles on late antique literature and culture. Prior to his fellowship at the Kluge Center, he was a junior fellow in the Harvard Society of Fellows from 2004 to 2007, and a fellow in Byzantine Studies at Dumbarton Oaks Research Library from 2009 to 2010. As of this coming academic year, he will be leaving his position in the Classics Department at Washington and Lee University to take up a joint position at Georgetown University in the Classics Department and at Dumbarton Oaks. His work at the Kluge Center has been focused on the topic of his current monograph project concerning the role of geography and travel in the development of late antique and Byzantine literature. His talk today comes directly out of his new research and is entitled From Ptolemy to Pilgrimage, Images of Late Antiquity in Geography, Travel, and Cartography. Please welcome him, Dr. Scott Johnson.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me in the back? Yes? Good. Okay. All right, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be here this year to interact with so many different scholars from around the world. It really is an international group, and I think that's been very inspiring for me. Thank you especially to Carolyn Brown and Mary Lou Reeker for their hospitality and their friendship. So I would reiterate all that Chris said a bit earlier with regard to this place. I've really enjoyed my time here. And thank you to Chris as well for sharing the podium with me today and for our many conversations about pre-modern society. Sometime around the year AD 300, a map was produced unlike any other that has survived from the ancient world. This map is today called the Tabula Peutingeriana, or Peutinger Table, named after its early modern owner, Conrad Peutinger. We know from Peutinger himself that he received the map as a bequest in 1508 from a Conrad Bickel, but prior to this bequest, we have no external information about where or when it was produced or what its transmission history was. In fact, had this map not survived, scholars today may have no idea that the Romans could have produced such a monument of cartography. The Peutinger Table thus provokes by its very existence a host of questions about the way that ancient thinkers viewed the world they lived in and how they sought to describe that world. As I will attempt to show in this talk, the Peutinger Table offers an important, though perplexing, vista on ancient geographical thought. I will contend that it should be read alongside a host of other attempts at geographical description, both contemporary to it as well as prior and subsequent to its creation. However, these attempts are not primarily maps, but literary texts. Important continuities and discontinuities arise when these are compared with the Peutingers table. Thus, against those who would treat the Peutingers table as a sui generis composition of the late ancient world without comparandum, or who perhaps might wish to read the Peutingers table only as one early step in the teleological history of scientific cartography, a narrative in which the Peutingers table does not come out looking very good in the end, I would argue that this map, the only world map to survive from the Greco-Roman world, offers a unique opportunity to explore in detail the cultural history of the period in which it was originally made. This period, called Late Antiquity in the scholarship, roughly 300 to 600 AD, or from Constantine to Muhammad, has come to be viewed over the past 50 years as a crucial transitional period in Mediterranean and Middle Eastern history, and consequently, the study of contemporary late antique views of the breadth and length of their late antique world has significance for history writ large. More on this later. For now, I would like to turn to the map. In its surviving form, the Peutingers table, now in the Austrian National Library in Vienna, is not an autograph version but a medieval copy, dating to around AD 1200, with an original underlying composition dating to, as I said, probably around AD 300, though some claim it was as much as 500 years later. Not having the autograph is not very surprising, since we very rarely have autographed copies of works by ancient authors. We are always working with copies of copies, though fortunately in this case it is generally agreed that the medieval copy has reproduced the original accurately. The original setting and context are unknown, but some guesses have been advanced on the basis of internal evidence, and I will point these out in a moment. In conception, the Peutingers table is schematic, not resembling anything modern viewers might recognize as a map. It is severely elongated, and the aesthetics of the map are dominated by this elongation. In its surviving form, it is 22 feet, or 6.72 meters, long, and 1 foot, or 33 centimeters, tall. It is today separated into 11 parchment sheets, though originally it may have been a seamless whole and possibly rolled up as a scroll for portability. If one includes a purported lost western portion of 3 parchment sheets, it could be as much as 28 feet, or 8.6 meters long. At 1 foot high, the map thus squeezes the ancient world from Britain to Sri Lanka into an extraordinarily narrow frame. For example, Italy is completely horizontal, and the Mediterranean Sea occupies only a narrow strip of water in the map's middle. The Mediterranean in this image is the lower strip of water, the Adriatic being the top strip of water. The Peutingers' visual depiction of the oikumene, the ancient Greek word for inhabited world, where we get our word ecumenical from, is thus quite striking and even disorienting for modern viewers who are used to looking at scale maps. This is an image of the extreme western surviving portion of the map, with Britain showing up on the left-hand side of this image. This is an image of the eastern Mediterranean. The island in the middle is Cyprus, and Alexandria and the Nile Delta are to the right of the Mediterranean. This is the far eastern section. Most of the lands in this picture the Romans had no firsthand knowledge of, so this is derived largely from legend. Sri Lanka, which we saw in an image that Chris displayed, is actually at the very bottom right of this image. You can see the little island off the coast of India. Often, the Peutingers table is interpreted in the scholarship as a prime example of Roman imperial mapping techniques, and more generally as a cipher of the perception of space by late Roman travelers. In this view, one of the table's most salient features is the huge quantity of cities and smaller towns listed on the map, all connected by a vast network of highways and roads. Icons of various sizes represent the individual cities, hostels, waypoints, baths, and imperial capitals. To return to Alexandria, this is an image of the symbol of the imperial capital, which shows up about 4 times on the map, with Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, and Constantinople. This basic local information for a user of the map on the ground stands somewhat in tension with the comprehensive scope of the map. Would a traveler be expected to take these routes all the way from Rome to India? Would the routes actually get him there? Like the equally famous and unique Notitia Dignitatum, the Peutingeriana table appears to be an attempt to take account of the entire material and topographical infrastructure of the late Roman world. The Notitia, dating to the early 5th century, so over 100 years later than the Peutingeriana table, comprises a luxurious illustrated handbook of the provinces of the later Roman Empire, listing all the material resources of the Roman army in particular, including the permanent stations of the major legions and the special titles of regional governors. Significantly for my purposes, both documents express this infrastructure through a geographical depiction of the world, however schematic or stylized it may be. Indeed, the stylization is a clue, I think, to what is going on in these massive imperial productions. Let me go ahead and provide some conclusions up front. While the word tabula is not the standard Latin word for map, which is forma, it does accurately denote, in its definition of accounts table, some of the salient features of the Peutingeriana table and indeed geographical literature from late antiquity in general. First, that is, the accumulation and organization of complete knowledge, or encyclopedism, especially as an aesthetic choice or argument. Secondly, two-dimensionality, often on a grand scale but with attendant distortion. In other words, an attempt to experiment with the parchment sheet in creative ways. Third, a precarious balance between the apparent intentions of the work, such as to provide guidance on how to move from one place to another, and the burden placed on a viewer or reader who may try to use it for that specific purpose. These 3 fundamental qualities appear in different guises depending on the work in question, be it visual or literary, but they show up repeatedly. Before considering these ideas further, it would be worth glancing at the only other large-scale map from this period which could be brought to bear on the discussion. The Severan marble plan of the city of Rome, known today among scholars as the Forma Urbis Romae and surviving only in fragments, is a map that comes from the earliest stage of our period, dating to around AD 200. Before the Christian Empire. Set up by the Emperor Septimius Severus in the restored Templum Pacus, that is, the forum of the Emperor Vespasian dating originally to around AD 75, this gargantuan inscribed map has long been recognized as essentially impractical for the urban traveler in the city. For one, its height, scale, and detail would have likely made a quick consultation of the map impossible. In particular, a ladder was required to make use of the minute details of the plan, which seems to have prohibited a functional viewing of the map at a distance. This is a fragment from which you can see the detail of the plan, including small rooms like broom closets even, but you can also see that large famous monuments like the Porticus Livii were inscribed and labeled. Here is the major gladiatorial school in Rome. And this is an image of numerous fragments, which are all online, by the way. Further, if viewers trusted the information on the map, they may not arrive at their destination, since the map, at least according to the surviving fragments, is inaccurate in a number of places. The question of inaccuracy, however, is not the most pertinent theme. Rather, the Forma Urbis Romae, like the Peutingeriana table 100 years later, makes a visual statement about the conception of the local world through its accumulation and organization of knowledge. Jennifer Trimble at Stanford argues that the Forma Urbis Romae should be interpreted in light of the grand Roman tradition of imperial visual monuments, such as the Column of Trajan. Both of these monuments, according to Trimble, quote, overwhelm the viewer with a mass of veristic detail. The word veristic is helpful in that the huge amount of apparently true details on an overwhelming canvas is what produces the aesthetic effect on the viewer. As Richard Talbert at UNC has noted in a comparison of the two maps, quote, their design makes a feature of incorporating quantities of items that individually are dull, even trivial, but cumulatively make a powerful impression. The interplay between the collection of information, practicable or not, and the aesthetic rendering of that information is crucial also to the emergence of pilgrimage literature in the Christian Roman Empire. There is thus an important connection between the Peutingeriana table and the pilgrimage texts of the period, which I will survey shortly. The scholarly debate over the Peutingeriana table centers on just how fundamental the written Roman genre of the itinerarium is to the composition of the map. Talbert has argued for a holistic approach, reading the route network alongside the more decorative elements of the map. In Talbert's words, quote, I see it as a project of a single designer who was already an experienced cartographer, but who was sufficiently creative and ambitious to experiment here both with the map's shape and with featuring land routes. He aimed above all to convey how civilized, peaceful, and united in appearance the entire Orbis Terrarum represented under Roman sway, with the city of Rome at its center and focal point. Incidentally, the city of Rome at the center only works when the posited 3 extra western sheets are included, which is Talbert's argument. This statement stands in contrast to the approach of Kai Brodersen at Erfurt in Germany, particularly in his preference to understand the Peutingeriana table as merely a visual key to a list of destinations, a true itinerarium pictum, or drawn itinerary. In Brodersen's view, the Peutingeriana table behaves most like the familiar London tube map, which connects stations without direct reference to overland geography. Like the table's Mediterranean strip of water, the only real-world geographical feature on the tube map is the River Thames, one crucial datum being, presumably, which side of the river or ocean you are on. This approach draws on the work of Pietro Ianni, who coined the term hodological, from Greek he hodos, route or way, to discuss the route-mindedness of ancient conceptions of moving through space. That is, that they thought about motion in a linear fashion and not three-dimensionally or proportionally. And I can add here the old London tube map from 1908, which does actually include overland geography, but was deemed less useful or functional. And then the Metro map, which behaves very similarly, except with the addition of park space. However, Talbert has countered Brodersen with the observation based on GIS overlays with the Peutingeriana table that numerous gulfs, inlets, and islands on the map seem to reveal a cartographer very concerned about the physical geography of the seas. However, the accuracy of the physical geography, even with regard to maritime details, is uneven. The Bosporus and Golden Horn around Constantinople, which one would have thought was important, are uncharacteristically exaggerated on the Peutingeriana table, and in a strange twist, Sardinia's route network, which is coincidentally known in detail from the contemporary Antonine itinerary, is completely absent from the Peutingeriana table. In the end, despite this debate over accuracy and over against its hodological qualities, Talbert states, quote, no one was ever meant to consult it seriously as a guide to land routes. And referring to both the Peutingeriana table and the Forma Urbis Romae, he claims, quote, neither was ever seriously intended for use. In his most recent contribution, the magisterial book Rome's World, 2010, which summarizes and refines his previous arguments, Talbot takes the decorative argument to the extreme. The Peutingeriana table was merely decoration, if one wants to put it like that, for the apse of an imperial reception room under the Tetrarchy in the late 4th century AD. While these two views of the Peutingeriana table, the hodological associated with Broderson and the decorative associated with Talbot, have each been helpful in challenging our native assumptions about this perplexing map, a central vexing question brought to light by Talbot himself still remains. Why did the author of the Peutingeriana table care so much about cartographic detail? If it is merely a route map, or primarily meant to adorn, what is the virtue of minutely rendered and often accurate Mediterranean coastlines? Perhaps here Trimble's felicitous phrase, vertiginous cartography, in reference to the Forma Urbis Romae, is especially helpful as an aesthetic clue. In her words, the map's totality impinged on the eye, end quote. That is, the stockpiling of data is its own artistic argument. Among the profusion of literary texts written under the late Roman Empire, in Greek, Latin, and various Eastern Mediterranean languages like Syriac and Coptic, within the geographical framework, most of the Latin writers significantly stuck very close to the overland travel genre, the itinerarium. It has been posited that this relates to the mature Roman imperial tradition of land surveying, known from the Corpus Agrimensorium, a 6th century AD collection that gathers texts from well back into the period of the Republic, as well as to the Romans' demonstrable commitment to infrastructure, namely roads, forts, and way stations, also, of course, a long-standing Roman tradition. The circa AD 300 Antonine itinerary, roughly contemporary with the Peutingeriana table, offers an example of an imperial itinerarium with a clear dependence on the Roman road network, the cursus publicus, and its overlying provincial system, both of which serve as conceptual frameworks which enable its literary expression. Within these frameworks, an individual could chart his or her own travel experiences, making use of customary habits of writing. The data collected along the way, which could be as bare as merely the number of Roman miles between staging posts, was easily slotted into the genre as a linear narrative, serving imperial or other interests. This is a detail from the medieval manuscript of the Corpus Agrimensorium. And then this is a printed sheet, just as Chris uses printed books, I use printed books. I'm not Indiana Jones, no matter how esoteric this may seem. But you can see in the left column, there's 4 columns here. The left column, the city names or stopping posts, and then on the right column, you have the number of miles between each one. That's how the text works. In an itinerarium, both the writer and reader make the journey out to a destination and the journey back to the starting point. Additionally, with the broad adoption of the Codex in the Mediterranean in the late 3rd and 4th centuries AD, that is, the book, a reader could access the narrative at multiple random points without having to read through their linear progression in toto as with a scroll. For this reason, the Antonine itinerary, originally an early imperial or even perhaps a Republican-era document, was recopied into an enlarged late antique form and made more useful via the Codex. This tradition depended on the Roman cursus publicus, or imperial postal network, and involved at a basic level the compilation and repackaging of information from Roman milestones set up along this network throughout the empire. As with the Peutingeriana table, pictorially, the cursus publicus dominates the written landscape of the Antonine itinerary. The Christian adoption of the itinerarium genre began, according to surviving texts, precisely in AD 333 with an anonymous text known as the Bordeaux Pilgrim. Following the unitary Mediterranean rule of the Emperor Constantine I from AD 324 on, In the subsequent travels of his mother Helena in the Eastern Empire, 326 to 327, the Holy Land became a more lively destination for well-off travelers. The advent of Christian travel to the east coincided with the monumentalization of the region with imperially sponsored churches and other buildings. However, the relationship between these two phenomena is complex, and I would hesitate to argue that either one was the cause of the other. Since the Bordeaux Pilgrim is written in the itinerarium genre, it mostly reads like a list of cities, miles, and way stations, exactly in the genre of the Antonine itinerary. This is from the same text, the Bordeaux Pilgrim. It looks exactly the same as the Antonine itinerary in parts, which I've given you on the right for reference. However, the author manipulates the genre in creative ways. First, to include various points of interest, mainly pagan, along the route. Second, when it comes to Jerusalem, the narrative blossoms out quite substantially and it becomes a topography of the city based on biblical sites, mainly Jewish, and implementing the cognitive tool of stacking holy sites across the centuries, a hallmark of subsequent pilgrimage texts. This is an image of when you get to Jerusalem with the Bordeaux Pilgrim, and even if you don't know Latin, you can see that the narrative structure is completely different visually from the itinerarium genre. So something is changing in the genre. The Bordeaux Pilgrim does mention 4 Constantinian churches at Golgotha, Bethlehem, the Mount of Olives, and Mamre. But this number is dwarfed by the huge number of Jewish sites, perhaps signaling an established Jewish pilgrimage network which is unknown from other contemporary sources. Narratively speaking, the Bordeaux Pilgrim becomes quite a different type of text in the Jerusalem section, and space and time are both conceived in a more detailed or granular fashion. Another Constantinian era text, not a pilgrimage account, but a text which highlights the biblical character of early Christian pilgrimage, is Eusebius of Caesarea's Onomasticon, or name book. This alphabetized work proceeds book by book in the Bible within a given letter of the Greek alphabet and provides contemporary names and information on sites mentioned therein. Its main purpose was to correlate lost Hebrew toponyms with their Greco-Roman equivalents, an intellectual service that proved so necessary for pilgrims that a massive floor mosaic from the 6th century, the Madaba map, discovered in 1896 and only partially surviving, is thought to represent a visual compendium of Eusebius's dictionary. It was originally massive in scale, comprising 2.5 million glass tesserae, about the same number as in the apse mosaics at Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, which is a contemporary mosaic. While the question of what it is doing in a small church in a 6th century town in the Transjordan, where pilgrims were unlikely to visit, is still debated, nevertheless, Jerusalem on this map is clearly at the center, and the mosaic owes a great deal to Eusebius's attempt to map the Bible onto the sacred topography of the late Roman Holy Land. This is a detail of Jerusalem with all of the toponyms of the biblical story around, in Greek, around the city, which is architecturally actually more accurate than you might think from a mosaic. One of the Latin scholars who took inspiration from Eusebius is the late 4th century scholar, Latin scholar, Jerome. Jerome's scholarly interest in biblical geography was derived directly from Eusebius's Onomasticon and other texts, and he combined it with a keen appreciation of the spiritual value of Christian pilgrimage, a practice which Eusebius, interestingly, does not comment upon. In AD 404, Jerome wrote a letter to Eustochium, the daughter of a close friend of his, Paula, who had recently died. Jerome reminded Eustochium of the journey the three of them made to the Holy Land nearly 20 years before, a journey which resulted in all three residing in Bethlehem for the better part of the ensuing 2 decades. With Paula's personal wealth, they built monastery complexes and hostels for pilgrims while greatly increasing the touristic fame of Bethlehem as a spiritual site, particularly the cave grotto where Jesus' nativity was venerated. Jerome, Paula, and Eustochium received pilgrims even from outside the oikumene, including India, Persia, and Ethiopia. Yet at the same time, they further rooted themselves into the local spiritual landscape of Judea, especially through a close study of Hebrew. Jerome, of course, was responsible for the translation of the Vulgate Bible, and Paula, his financier and student, could apparently chant psalms in Hebrew fluently without an accent, though raised in Rome as a Latin speaker. Thus, the 4th century crystallization of these parallel traditions, biblical scholarship and pilgrimage, find their meeting point in the work of Jerome. This is a conclusion one could take away from the titles of individual works, but only recently has geography been recognized as a constituent component of Jerome's entire corpus. Roughly contemporary with Jerome and Paula's self-installation in Bethlehem, the Western pilgrim Egeria from the Atlantic coast of Spain spent the years 381 to 384 traveling to numerous sites in the Holy Land, in and around Jerusalem, as well as far to the south in Sinai and to the north in Mesopotamian Edessa. This is her pilgrimage journey from Constantinople. While Egeria makes use of the itinerarium form, she also includes many details of the sites she visits, and, like the Bordeaux pilgrim, quotes scripture. However, Egeria's bibliophilia is much more prominent. She notes that she carries around codices of the Bible, which she pulls out whenever an apt passage needs to be read on site. But she also has copies or obtains them on the way of apocryphal narratives, such as the Acts of Thomas or the Abgar correspondence at Edessa, and the Acts of Thecla at Seleucia in southern Asia Minor. This aspect of her text is very important in that it shows how hagiography, that is, saints' lives, the Bible, and travel literature were all coming together during the late 4th century, and how hybrid literary forms were being forged at the same time as the Christian imagination was extending the received history of the Hebrew and apostolic worlds. To return to the theme of accumulation, Egeria organizes this diversity of information and observation through 2 modes. First, the itinerary itself, which provides a narrative framework, as with the Bordeaux pilgrim, though Egeria makes more detours off the beaten path, and major ones at that. And secondly, a now truncated second half of the text, an account of the Jerusalem Holy Week liturgy, which makes up the second half of the text, at least as we have it today. I have chosen here not to discuss the latter, but it is an evocative microcosmical or cross-sectional counterpart to the grand tour narrative in the first half. Subsequent Christian texts build on Egeria's use of the itinerarium model, not least the anonymous Piacenza pilgrim from the mid-6th century, which demonstrates an even more expressive devotional quality. The New Testament is notably more prominent in the Piacenza pilgrim, and newly established patterns of movement and veneration are apparent. The pilgrim dwells on sites such as the synagogue in Nazareth, where Jesus learned his ABCs. He kisses the ground of Jesus' tomb on Golgotha, as well as the relics of the true cross at the Holy Sepulchre. Like Egeria, he also visits Sinai in Egypt, though taking note of a temple that Mary and Jesus supposedly, or apocryphally, visited in Memphis, and in Syrian Antioch, further demonstrating the intensified devotional character of Christian pilgrimage in the 6th century. The Piacenza pilgrim takes note of a suite of 9 martyrs' tombs, all buried in mausolea crowned by the instrument of their torture. This text in the late 6th century shows the true beginnings of what we think of as medieval pilgrimage in the West. However, in terms of its literary affinities, it shares more with the itinerarium tradition than with most later texts. The journey serves the needs of the compilation, and as many topics and sites as possible are stacked into each episodic sequence. In other words, this is the encyclopedia of the late antique spiritual imagination. At the end of the 7th century, the abbot of the Iona monastery, Adamnan, most famous for his life of St. Columba, produced a work called On the Holy Places, De Locis Sanctis. Ostensibly a pilgrimage account dictated by the Frankish bishop Arculf, who had shipwrecked on the western shore of Scotland during his return from Jerusalem, a nearly impossible trajectory, actually. The De Loci Sanctis has been shown to be, in certain sections, a patchwork of scholarly observations taken from earlier authors, particularly Jerome. Significant as it is that the De Loci Sanctis is, one, the first post-Arab conquest pilgrimage narrative to have survived, and thus includes, by necessity, some original material at least, particularly for Damascus and Alexandria, and two, provides the basis for the Venerable Bede's own De Loci Sanctis a generation later. Despite those 2 points, one of the most important qualities has been somewhat overlooked, namely that it amasses and organizes information about the Holy Land that previously appeared in separate books, synthesizing this material through the potentially artificial device of a contemporary pilgrim's own words. The De Loci Sanctis is above all a compilation, in an attempt to draw together a large amount of knowledge about the Eastern Mediterranean from very disparate sources in different original languages. The fact that Adamnan is making use of the literary device of a potentially fictitious pilgrim from the 7th century is only one of a number of creative choices he makes throughout the work. He repeatedly compares Arculf's testimony to that of books he has on his shelf, positively compares him, and he refers to drawings Arculf made on a wax tablet of the Holy Sepulchre in his presence. Arculf had been there so many times that he could recall its exact dimensions from memory, apparently. These notices seek to confirm Arculf's account of his journey, but they also draw attention to other texts and different sources of authority rather than the raw pilgrimage narrative itself or alongside it. If we had more time, I would attempt to cast the net somewhat wider, and I'm doing so in the work that this comes out of, to include other texts than strict travel narratives or pilgrimage narratives. The process of collecting functional data via a creative literary endeavor in a number of genres can be found, particularly those texts dealing with astronomy and cosmology. And in the Latin West, at least, from Macrobius's Commentary on the Dream of Scipio to Martianus Capella's Marriage of Philology and Mercury, which is late 5th century, to Gregory of Tours on the Course of the Stars, 6th century, the forgery hoax text Ethicus Ister, dating from 700, and the Ravenna Cosmography, also 700. While not a complete list by any means, all of these examples could be reasonably labeled encyclopedic and all have what might be called an archival aesthetic, particularly with regard to the geographical and cosmological theories that they include in their schemas. But to conclude, this shared literary mode of expression between so many different geographical texts, and shared as well with the only world map to survive from the Greco-Roman world, is striking and very important for the history of the transformation of the ancient world into the medieval world. Let me reiterate in conclusion what I consider to be the constitutive elements of this aesthetic of accumulation. First is the accumulation and organization of complete knowledge, or encyclopedism, particularly with regard to geography. The second is a creative two-dimensionality, or an experimentation with parchment sheets, but with a distortion in the image. Third, I would highlight the burdens that are placed upon the viewer or the reader in terms of making use of the genre, which is ostensibly for practical purposes. I would like to add to these three constitutive elements three further conclusions about what makes the transmission of this type of geographical writing possible. I suggest literary continuity such as this stems from the following factors. The first factor is the conservative approach to the genre generally, that is the legacy of the classical world. Where innovation occurs, it always does so with reference to the auctores, that is the authorities of previous centuries. This principle continues throughout the medieval period, both East and West, and in disparate genres. The second factor in this continuity is the value and success of the literary form of the Roman itinerarium, which far outlasted the imperial route network that served as its inspiration. Of course, the itinerarium genre is partly defined in late antiquity by its elasticity and is in this way quite innovative, particularly in its Christian adaptations. Finally, and most importantly, authors from late antiquity on were intrinsically drawn to an aesthetic of accumulation and encyclopedism. The final point may seem to be circular logic, given that earlier I defined the Peutingeriana table in the pilgrimage text partly through the conjunction of a synoptic viewpoint and their encyclopedism. But it is worth emphasizing that the aesthetic of accumulation was not only a descriptive quality of geographical writing in late antiquity, but it was also prescriptive. The organization of knowledge was one of the required principles of the literary and cartographic art of the period. Technical and more general genres mixed and mingled, and the hybridity of form and genre, all within the framework of the Greco-Roman, Jewish, and Christian inheritance, became one of the focal points for authors from the 4th century on, both East and West. When this aesthetic of accumulation is recognized as a creative force in late antique Byzantine and medieval literature, the old juggernauts of decline and literary epigonality lose much of their power. From this point of view, I would contend that the study of geographical literature and cartography from late antiquity adds an important element to the scholarly debate over the transformation of the ancient world into the medieval one. Thank you. A few questions, maybe? Yes. Sure. I can explain everything you don't understand about everything. Right, so this will give you some sense. I have a pointer, but maybe it's not very helpful. Can you see the mouse on the screen? Okay. So these are the 11 sheets, which all overlap a little bit. There's repetitions on each side of the image, which is kind of interesting. This is the entire thing. So for Rome, Talbot really wants Rome to be at the center. He wants it to be in the middle. He wants it to be an imperial production that was placed in the receiving hall of an emperor in what is called the Tetrarchic period, the rule of the 4 emperors in the late 4th century. But for that to happen mathematically, you would have to have 1, 2, and 3 added to this sheet, to the length of the map. Currently, what are numbered 1, 2, and 3 here do not exist. I mean, we don't have them unless we discover them somewhere. We don't have them. So right now, the middle of the map is somewhere in the Balkans, I think. So the original setting and the arguments about the purpose and the function of the map are actually in Talbert's argument, intrinsically related to the addition of these 3 other sheets. And I think that element is something that people who have dealt with the Peutingeriana, which has received a lot of attention, have not fully recognized in his arguments that but for his whole framework of argument to be true, it needs to have these 3 other portions. And I'm inclined to agree with him. I mean, he's a great cartographer himself. He was the editor of the Barrington Atlas of the ancient world and knows a lot about mapping. But I wanted to make it clear that that's part of the overall argument of where this map was produced and what it was for. James?
Yeah, just to follow up to that one. So what's on the left-hand side of the 4th segment, and what would be on the
Right.
3?
So the left-hand side, this is the first segment. So this is the left-hand side of the fourth is right here, which is Britain. So one could presume, I think it's undeniable, that there was another, at least one other sheet that included Britain. And this was probably produced, almost certainly produced before 410, at which point the Roman government was when Rome was sacked, and in response, the Roman government removed its troops from Britain and actually ceded Britain to the indigenous peoples. So I think that Britain was still a part of this world, very much so, this imperial world, and I think you would have had one other sheet there at least. Now, what about the other two?
So would the argument be really, it's undeniable that there's at least one more, that it would be significant that Britain might have in three whole segments rather than one?
You're trying to make your country more important than it is, my friend.
Just wondering if that's what he's suggesting.
No. I doubt, given the scale of the map, and the scale of the map is a problem, right? Because it's not to scale, so it's hard to make these hypotheses about the scale. But my intuition would be that the scale of the map would lead to one other sheet. Now, the question of whether they included Ireland or not, Ireland, as you probably know, was not a part of the Roman world, really, not until much later than this, 6th century or so. And at that point, it wasn't part of the Roman world, it was just part of the inheritance of the Roman world. So would they have included fictitious places, or would there have been one sheet that was, say, a legend for the map that explained where it was made? I think that's a good argument. Talbot does make that argument that at least on part of the first section would have been a legend that explained its provenance, a colophon, as it were, to the map. And I think that there's some truth to that. But what the other things that would have been described on the map or drawn on the map, I would love to know, because there would be a Western sort of imaginary comparandum to the Eastern imaginary section, which is India, but which in terms of detail is largely imaginary and based upon primarily accounts of Alexander's conquest in India, but without any real understanding of what the geography was like. Cardinal McCarrick? Yes. There are duplications. It's not very much, but it's a little bit. And so I mentioned that it's only possible that it was rolled up as a scroll to begin with. And actually, Talbot has moved us, I think, away from that argument substantially, because not just because he wants it to be, on a wall somewhere, but because of this overlap question and the fact that these sheets would have been sewn together. Now, they were sewn together in the early modern period, and they were actually separated for preservation's sake and for study. But it very rarely comes, the map very rarely comes out of the library. I mean, if you ask to look at it, they won't let you, usually, at least in my understanding. Nathan?
You say at the end that you thought that two-dimensionality represented intentional manipulation of scale, relation. Does that mean that you then take a position on early 4th century conception of space?
Right. So the question is about two-dimensionality and whether I think that the stylization of the two-dimensional framework is intentional and whether that has implications for the way that the Romans thought about space. I'm of the opinion that the map maker of the Peutingeriana table was, as with the Forma Urbis Romae, as with the geographical text, was very intentional in what they were doing. I don't think that we can just look at this and say, this is primitive scientific cartography. It may not be scientific cartography in the way that we think about that today, but there are choices that are being made in this that are inexplicable outside of the fact that this is the artist's choice to do it in this way. There's a choice of colors, which we think are somewhat accurate in the medieval copy. There's a choice of orientation. There's a choice of which cities to include. There's a choice of which mountain ranges, the accuracy of certain coastal regions. There's all kinds of things that suggest that this map maker was very skilled and intentional in what he was doing, or what the team was doing. So yes, I would say that. I'm sort of halfway in between Broderson and Taubert, if you didn't gather that. I think that there's a lot of hodological stuff going on here, that there is a narrative framework, a genre framework of one stop after another, and that there is a linear way of thinking about, particularly overland. I think it's an interesting problem that the coasts are well represented or well drawn, or accurately drawn, because it does not, to my mind, derive anything from the Greek sailing tradition of the periplus genre, which just means sailing around, but that was a Greek complement to the Roman itinerarium genre, where they talked about each port along a certain path along the coast. And even though they're close in genre, they're not the same thing. And I think it's a problem that both of these are included. Both of these elements are included in the map. Chris? Right. So the question is about whether there is a time signature, as it were, in the map, that whether the details of the map are about time rather than space. And I would say yes. There's an element of, there's a vector in the map. I don't think it's a chronological sequence in the large scale of chronology, but I think that there's a movement from one place to another. Again, the question of accuracy, whether you could get from one place to another on the basis of the map, is somewhat, I think, secondary to the primary issue that the map was conceived as a route network. And so that needs to be established first. The accuracy is an important question for Roman historians, for historians of particular cities and regions, and how the cities interacted in those regions archaeologically. It's important. But I do think that because there is a mention on the far eastern portion of this is as far as Alexander got, okay? And so there's an element of, were we to go from Rome as far east as Alexander went in a kind of mimesis way, imitation sense, this is how far you could go. And so the world is sort of framed by this, I don't know if you want to call it literary or a kind of cultural inheritance of the Alexandrian, or of Alexander the Great's conquest. And so Central Asia and India, even though it's clear that they really have no idea where these places go, do play a role in that mental imagination. And in that sense, there is a journey, a real journey that took real time inscribed on the map. But it has this archaic feel to it, as if it's back, which it was a long time ago. So. Mary Lou?
Yes, I wanted to ask you, does it draw on Egyptian map making as well? And also you mentioned Egeria, and did you say this was a woman who was traveling? And I'd like to know more about that. That seems so unusual for that time.
Okay, so the first question is whether this had any, the Peutingeriana table has any connections to Egyptian map making, and I did show Alexandria on here, and it's clear that Alexandria was a major cultural center in the late antique Mediterranean. This goes without saying. It's a very Hellenized city, a very intellectual city. The maps we have from Egypt are much earlier than that, and they are sort of archaic maps from the time of the pharaohs. And so that's not my field, it's not my specialty, but I don't see any contemporary map making in Egypt that has survived that could be comparable to this. But Alexandria does show up prominently on the map, but so does Antioch, so does Constantinople, and so does Rome. The second question was about Egeria. Egeria is a pilgrim who made a pilgrimage from the western coast of Spain, northern Spain, to the Holy Land, Sinai, and Mesopotamia, via Constantinople from 381 to 384. And she left an account of this journey. Now, presumably a lot of people made this trip that did not leave accounts, and so as with any ancient or medieval problem, we're dealing with a question of evidence first. How representative is this? And in terms of your specific question as to whether this is representative of the freedom of movement of women, I would say yes, because we have other evidence of plenty of wealthy women. I mentioned Paula and Eustochium, who accompanied Jerome when he went from Rome to the Holy Land around the same time, 385, 386, and stayed with him there. And then we have other evidence. There is a famous text from the 5th century called The Life of Melania the Younger, who was a very wealthy young woman who gave up, with her husband, gave up their entire wealth, including an entire city villa complex in North Africa, which the text tells us about, and became ascetics in their own right, as did Paula and Eustochium, and went to the east. So there's a lot of freedom of travel for wealthy women from the west to the east. And this is part of what it means to have a Christian empire in this period, because the empire is there already, but when it's Christianized, and the role of pilgrimage actually kicks into gear, not the role, it doesn't have a functional sacramental role at this point, but the popularity, if we want to call it that, of pilgrimage, of Christian tourism, if we want to call it that, kicks into gear. It is possible to do it, okay? And so you have Helena going 326, 327, and then immediately in the surviving corpus, you have this text from 333, the Bordeaux Pilgrim. So you have an immediate response on the part of pilgrims to the opening up of the East to Christians. And is it a real response to the persecution that Christians felt under the Tetrarchy in the early 4th century? Possibly. Constantine made a big deal out of the churches and the basilicas that he founded. We know that from Eusebius's Life of Constantine and other texts as well. So there's a number of factors sort of coming together at this in the late 320s, early 330s that paved the way for people like Egeria and Melania the Younger later. The legend of the True Cross develops during this period with the first mention of Helena associated with the True Cross coming in 395. So the 4th century is really the sort of gestation period for full-blown pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And what's interesting about these early texts is that they are experimental, they are hybrid, they're trying to do something new with the literary genres and tools that they have at their disposal, just as they're using this Roman Empire and the cursus publicus, which is a tool at their disposal to make this journey. So there's a kind of interesting correspondence there between the social world and the literary world. Well done? Okay, thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.